At age 19, I hitched down to Morocco, and many weeks later I ended up at a big pass called the Tizian Test, and we looked out and I could just see there the edge of the desert, and I thought, just one day I really must come back here and go and have a look at that desert. And so that is the start of it. But then I think it was Christmas of 2018, I was trekking down the coast of Morocco with some camels and a guide and some friends, and the guide said to me, I've got a trek that I do in the Sahara Desert. And I said, well, that's fantastic. I've always wanted to do that, and this is the end result. You fly into Marrakesh to begin with and have an evening there looking around the souks and the big marketplace, maybe going to the old French gardens and just having a bit of a look round. Then the next day we drive up over the Atlas, over another big pass, and then all the way down through to Ouarzazate. Have a brief stop there, and then we drive on down to a little town called Mohammed. And then about another 20 minutes on from there, we stop the vehicles and then walk for an hour to get to our first camp. So when you get to the camp, you meet your camels. We had 5 camels, and you meet your camp crew. And there's a mess tent, a kitchen tent, modern sleeping tents. By this time you've now left all light pollution behind, and you are underneath one of the big sand dunes, and you can go up onto the top of the sand dune for sunset and to see the stars. And the night sky out in the Sahara Desert is really unbelievable. So the first day, you can still see that there are a scattering of palm trees and acacia trees and the remains of the old villages and farmland, which has been overtaken by the sands, and you still see the field boundaries and one or two villages that have been pretty much buried. The house consumed by the Sahara Desert. And you make your way through this area and then leave all the trees and vegetation behind and get out into the real desert. We thought it was fascinating, absolutely varied and interesting all the time. You go through all sorts of different types of thing in the desert. There are some big stony plains, there are valleys in between the dunes with hard-packed sandy soil that it's easy to walk on. Occasionally you go past big mesas, almost like John Wayne country. When you get right out into the desert and you go across these massive, flat, stony plains, you come to an area first where there are limestone rocks that appear that are full of fossils. And I looked it up when I got back home to check what the guide had been telling me, and sure enough, the fossils there in the deserts of Morocco date back some 250 to 450 million years, and they are really fantastic. It must have been an old sea, and the fossils are mainly of shells and crustacean type creatures. You really get a sense of age in the desert, the amount of time that things have taken to evolve there. And then after seeing the fossils, you come to an old caravan market meeting place. So caravans from all parts of the Sahara Desert used to meet at this place to trade and exchange goods and so on. And you can see there the old walls that surrounded the market. We're sitting on the remains of an old market, walls of the old market now. It's about 3 or 4 football pitches big, this place. That's all that's left. There is a place where you walk down the riverbed of the largest river in North Africa, the Dra, which hasn't had water in it for years, and you just walk down the bed of this river for some while. Strange flowers in the desert, in the riverbed of the Dra River. Very strange. We saw lots of evidence of wildlife, and we certainly saw lots of tracks of all sorts of things. Definitely desert fox. And then there were small rodents, and we could see burrows in the hard sand where the rodents lived. Lots of reptiles and dung beetles, and we had some real fun with some of the dung beetles. Boy, girl, dung beetle. Oh, and a third one.
Oh, trouble. Oh my word.
The trek is about 6 days in total, though 2 of those days are really quite short days. The 4 main days you're doing an average of about 10 miles a day. You do about 50 or 60 miles through the desert. So quite decent lengths walking, you know, really good walking. There was a well on the 4th day, and the camels hadn't drunk for 3 days. Yourself drinking as well, and so they were guzzling it down by the gallon, which was great fun to watch. Oh, Mr. Halloum. I absolutely love camels. You do have to be careful with them. They can be difficult, and you soon learn to know which ones are the grumpy ones and which ones are friendly camels. But when you get a really friendly camel, they are really so nice to be with. And the camels are waiting to say hello. Oh yes, there was one very special camel. This is Mr. Halloum. And Mr. Halloum was so friendly and very intelligent, and the wise man of the 5 camels. And I had quite an unusual close encounter with Mr. Halloum one evening in camp. I was just standing around chatting to somebody, and unheard, I couldn't hear him approaching, but Mr. Halloum came up behind where I was standing and rested his head on top of my head, which was such a shock. But he was that friendly. I mean, you could really make a fuss of him, and he enjoyed that attention. One of the things that I had worried about to begin with was that you know, to do this trek into the Sahara, you might be wading through soft sand for hours on end. It's not at all like that, actually. You're walking on either hard-packed sand or the remains of what was agricultural land before the desert arrived. It's only when you cross the big dunes, or you go to the top of the summits of the big dunes, that you have to struggle a bit in the soft sand. Yes, the really big sand dunes. There's a couple of nights, or I think 3 or 4 nights actually, we climbed up to the top of the biggest dune that we could find. What a view of our camp. Fantastic. And there you really see this just ocean of dunes stretching off into the distance, just like something straight out of Lawrence of Arabia. I mean, just fabulous. It's intimidating in that you really wouldn't want to get lost. And we kept saying to the guide, you know, how do you know which way to go? And he said, oh, I just have a feeling, I have a feeling. I suppose he's done it a few times. But It would be easy to get lost in this desert, yes it would. And to find our camp, for instance, at the end of a day, every day the camels would get on past us, they were going much faster than we would, and they get into camp and set the camp up. And in order for us to find the camp, the lads would go up onto the top of the nearest dune and erect on a tall pole a big flapping flag for us to find the camp. The best time to go onto the top of these really big dunes is at sunset, because the sunsets are spectacular. Just wonderful. You just sit up on the top there and just wait for the sunset. Just beautiful, beautiful memories I have of being on the top of those dunes. So we're now on the penultimate day of our trek through the Sahara, and we've got about 2.5 hours to go to get to the camp. We've just come up onto some big sandy dunes. Just panning around, and you can see the extent of the dunes. You wouldn't want to do this trek in the heat. You know, we were doing it in February. You could do it in November, December, January, February, and temperatures were very, very pleasant. We had one afternoon where the skies was completely clear, and it was just too hot to rest in the tent in the middle of the afternoon. It's going to be a hot camp here, isn't it? So we had a little rest, just lying in the shade of the tents. So that's about as hot as it got. Just very pleasant summer-like temperatures. One of the pleasures of trekking in Morocco is the food. The food on trek is just fabulous. Tagines, which we had virtually every day. On some of the evenings, the boys cooked bread in the sand, and to do that they gathered sort of wood together, old driftwood and so on, as they carried on through the day, and then they'd make a decent fire, collect the really hot charcoals, spread it out over the sand, get the sand really hot, and then they bury the bread in the sand and put more hot sand on top.
Straight into the fire.
Yeah. And you ended up with this beautiful, hot, tasty bread. Really delicious. So this is the last day now of our wonderful trek through the Sahara, and we have about an hour, 2 hours down to the end of the track and the roadhead, where we're going to be met by a Land Rover to drive out of the desert. So here we are on the last stretch. The last day is a relatively short day. You've only got about an hour and a half to 2 hours to get to the end of the trek, but it's still through really big dunes, and it's still wild country. You haven't got to any kind of civilization at this point. And we were crossing some dunes, and we saw this group of something like 30 camels going past us. And these are leading the group along, and there are 3 little baby camels. Yeah, lovely, look at that. There we are, mum and baby camels. Super. Are there more behind?
Yes.
Nobody with them, no sign that they were domesticated, carrying no loads or anything like that. I mean, to this day I don't know whether they were wild camels or whether somebody owned them or not. Our guides didn't know either. Tons of them. Really lovely sight to see. Another baby camel there. You can actually hear them making calls as well. These must be the end markers, the back markers here. Well, you can see a huge herd. Yes, it was a lovely thing to happen right at the end of the trek. Yes, it was. Here's our transport at the end of the trek.
Fresh.
Now all loaded up with our kit bags. Hussein!
Jalla.
Challa. When the vehicle turned up, we then drove for about 2.5 hours still through the desert to reach the first bit of greenery we'd seen for about a week. And then from there was a drive of about 4 hours to the old town of Bahil. There's a bit of a market there, it's a bit of a scruffy town, but then you come to the old Riyadh, which was the palace of some old sheikh or something in ancient times, and it's now been converted into a sort of really stunning little hotel, and there's a very lush garden there with all sorts of exotic birds, and the interiors are so typically Moroccan with tiles and beautiful ceilings and lots of carving and a real grandeur and the feel of the old Morocco. So this is our last day on our way now back to Marrakesh. The point about our Sahara trek is that I wanted it to be a complete circuit, not just going into the desert, back to Mohammed and then drive back to Marrakesh the way we'd come. This takes you right the way through on a big circuit, through lots of towns and villages on the edge of the desert that are very pretty and very interesting. And just over on our left is the Tizian Test Pass that we're crossing. And then eventually took us through to the very pass that I'd stood on when at the age of 19. It's the low point you can see on the ridge. There we'll be zigzagging up to that pass. And sure enough, the road going up to the pass is really very exciting. And this is just one small section of the road coming up to the pass itself. There's a stretch there where we drove very slowly because I think even the drivers were a little bit nervous. But it was fine, and we got up onto the pass, which is where I'd stood when I was age 19 and looked out over towards the desert. And that indeed is where all the inspiration came from, and that was a lovely end for me. It was a real sort of trip down memory lane, quite emotional in fact.